This is the first time that I have found it virtually impossible to come to some kind of a reasonable compromise.
Some people don't want to see any deer killed in any way, and there are people that take the other extreme.
Some people feel that the deer was at one time a Bambi-type thing as predicted by Walt Disney, and then they came in the yards and ate their tulips, it became rattling hoofs.
I think that it's so polarized that in this town it will never be the same.
White-tailed deer sightings are on the rise in many parts of North America, and suburban residents are experiencing mixed reactions.
We lived here for 5 to 7 years with no deer damage, and if we saw a deer, we were really excited by its rare sighting. But progressively, through the next 15 years or so, we had more and more damage to our personal plantings, our vegetable garden here, and put up fences in the winter time first, and then year-round, and then they went from 3 to 6 to 8 feet in order to keep the deer out.
The habitat simply has come back in some states like New York and Pennsylvania from the intensive farming of the late 1800s and early 1900s, so that it's now just ideal deer habitat, and there are oftentimes too many deer in the area.
Residential development often provides an ideal environment for excessive deer population growth. Wildlife experts have noted a significant increase in deer numbers near suburban communities since the mid-1970s. Larger herd size has been attributed to various factors, including an abundance of food sources from ornamental shrubs and gardens, protective cover provided by parks and posted land, hunting restrictions imposed by local governments and rural property owners, and the disappearance of predators.
At this point, we've removed all their natural predators except for Buicks and minivans, and we leash our dogs, and deer are responding to increased deer habitat, contrary to what a lot of people think. We've made the habitat better by creating lots of edge, and they have responded by reproducing.
Considering the fact that mature females have 2 fawns per year, and if you reduce mortality and allow them to grow naturally, and you don't have predators, and there is no significant source of natural mortality, then you can expect a population of deer to grow about 30 to 40% per year. And that's a pretty high rate of return. We get 3 to 4% in our interest-bearing savings accounts now. We're talking 30 to 40%, which means that a deer population can double in 2 to 3 years.
When allowed to multiply unchecked, the animals can pose a serious threat to property and human safety as well as to themselves. Frequent car-deer-related accidents and excessive damage to commercial forests, agricultural crops, nursery stock, and landscape plantings are signs of an overabundance of deer. Populations can be categorized in 2 different ways. Biological carrying capacity refers to the number of deer that a parcel of land can support over an extended period of time. Social carrying capacity is defined by the maximum number of deer that can compatibly coexist with human populations.
The biological carrying capacity is really the more fundamental, because let's say that there ought to be 1,000 deer in an area and yet have a nice understory with a rich diversity of flowering plants and so on. If the people want 5 times that many deer, it would be better to respect the ecology of the area than to have the people's wishes satisfied and just simply have too many deer, with the resulting problems that high deer numbers bring.
The animal's appetite for buds and twigs from valuable ornamental shrubs and garden plants is a concern for many homeowners.
There are homeowners who love to see deer and will tolerate damage to some extent, but a number of homeowners, having lost their broccoli crop 2 or 3 years in a row, become obsessed about keeping the deer out and become absolutely intolerant of any deer encroachment. So it's a perception problem and an individual assessment of the damage and what's being done. I think the suburbanite, the people who have moved out of town and want to own 2 or 3 acres of land and a nice home are going to have to tolerate some of the so-called deer damage, because in many cases it's a nuisance problem and not an economic threat.
I think there are 3 primary issues. The first 2 have to do with public health and safety concerns. From research we've done in Westchester County and Islip, New York, we found that Lyme disease is present in those areas, and that's the #1 concern of residents there. And more generally, in other parts of the state, people's perceptions of the risk associated with deer car accidents is very important. And the third issue of less importance is suburban residents' concerns about deer damage to plantings.
Oftentimes, people who have experienced deer damage, they try to do several methods in order to prevent that damage, such as fencing, using repellents, or using a different plant species that's less desirable to deer. And in some instances, people just quit trying to plant ornamental plants around their homes.
If you must protect something, then you need to go to about an 8-foot fence that becomes an absolute barrier to deer. That's an expensive fence, and there are some possibilities short of that, using electrical fencing, 1 or 2 wires, using a simple fence in combination with the repellent that it seems to be more effective than using fencing alone. There are 2 or 3 repellents that are on the market now, and some others that we have tested that are experimental materials that seem to be very promising. We don't know what will happen when everyone uses the repellent, because the deer are not going to stand there and starve. They will feed on something. So when a homeowner uses a repellent, by and large, what happens is the deer just move to another location, to the neighbors.
By my planting things that deer don't eat, or by my fencing my property, I haven't gotten the deer not to eat. I've only created a problem for my neighbor. And as more people fence and plant unpalatable food for the deer, they will cross more and more streets in search of food. It doesn't solve the problem, it makes it worse.
When there is not enough food to go around, the health of the deer will suffer. Signs of starvation in the animals is an indicator of overpopulation. The condition of carcasses can be studied to determine cause of death and the physical condition of the herd.
The things that we use in New York State primarily are the antler beam measurements, the points, the beam measurement an inch above the burr, the fat content of the body around the internal organs. We look at the bone marrow as far as the amount of fat content in that bone marrow. By using the bone marrow, even though most of the deer may have been scavenged by other animals or dogs or whatever, we use the femur bone, and it's probably one of the heavier, more sturdy bones and with more bone marrow than most of the other bones. And most of the research in looking at deer have been done in New York State on that femur bone, and that's usually available. So as long as we find the skeleton of the animal, yes, within several months we can still give a pretty good indication of whether that deer had physical problems because of lack of food or some other reason. It's obvious that in this particular area the deer are in pretty poor physical condition.
As a result of problems associated with overpopulation, many local governments are faced with the challenge of suburban deer management. In an effort to help them meet that challenge, researchers and extension specialists from Cornell University and the State Department of Environmental Conservation cooperatively organized citizens' task forces in several deer management units, or DMUs, across New York State. Participants were selected in an effort to represent a broad range of ideas and concerns. One target community was located in the town of Irondequoit, near Rochester, New York. Bow hunting was banned by the local government there in 1978, and Monroe County regulations prohibit hunting in Durand Eastman Park, a county-managed facility located within the town limits. Consequently, deer populations in the area have grown with minimum restrictions since the late 1970s.
There is a real double whammy out there with both the parks as well as the Irondequoit town law prohibiting the discharge of firearms. When you get into a situation where you regulate yourself into a corner, then obviously you're going to have problems.
We've managed deer in New York State by controlling numbers through hunting, In this particular area, the state law did not provide for hunting. There were not very many deer here in the early to mid 1900s, and that it was only the last 20 years or so that deer populations really continued to increase, and numbers became a problem in some areas. In 1978, we changed the state law to allow for hunting in DMU 96, and during that, within a couple of years after that, the town of Irondequoit closed through local legislation for safety reasons or perceived safety reasons to close the area to even archery hunting.
I think it's clear because hunting accidents are relatively rare and involve firearms. The media reports tend to exaggerate these situations, okay? And it leads to the perception that hunting is unsafe. Well, that's certainly not true, okay? Hunting is very safe, and in fact, it's safer now than it ever has been.
Hunting is a controversial issue with a number of different people. There is no question that from DEC's, our department's standpoint, hunting is the option of choice. However, when you get politics and emotions and biology put together, you quickly find that they don't mix very well. And there are attitudes here that don't apparently want hunting to take place.
When we built this home in 1987. We came here because this was a forever wild area. We knew there were deer here. We came here because of the deer and the other wildlife. And there's a sign out there. You can't see it. There's too much foliage. But it says no carrying of weapons, no unauthorized motor vehicles. We felt this was a forever wild area that we were moving into. We paid a premium to be here. And within a year, I believe one of the politicians was promoting bow hunting in this park. We feel that we are much too close for hunting to be safe, us and the 4,000 or 5,000 other residents around here.
Management methods for suburban deer problems are obviously not easy to come up with a list, come up with possible and suggested ideas, but if it were an easy solution were available, we would have reached it a long time ago. The problem of suburban deer is not new, nor is it isolated to Irondequoit or even New York State. But we have a mindset in suburban people, particularly those who have no connection with harvesting food for subsistence, that Bambi is on a pedestal and that killing animals is a bad thing. I think everybody looks long-term to some non-lethal methods, such as contraception, as being a method of maintaining deer herds, but it also does nothing to reduce an already overpopulated herd.
A population of 1,000 deer that does not have hunting as a source of mortality, but has, let's say, representative sources of mortality and rates for the different causes of mortality for this area in central and southern New York, can actually grow in 10 years from 1,000 animals to 20,000, if you look at just the numerical growth. Now, it might be that before they get to that 20,000, the range is going to be sufficiently reduced in quality so that population growth would not be that rapid. Now, I have done simulations pointing out that if the range quality reduction is considered, then in 10 years, a population of 1,000 deer would grow to about 13,000 deer. And at that point, the female deer would be reproducing at about the lowest known level that they do. And at that point, or at any point when a deer population stabilizes, it will do so if there's about a 2/3 fawn mortality. Deer population will stabilize at some level, maybe 5 times higher than it should be, or 6 or 7 times higher, depending on how much food is made available to the deer by people.
Right, I think the primary issues with suburban and urban deer problems are ones of safety and humaneness and health to the animals in the ecosystem. We're certainly concerned about the rapidly increasing number of deer car collisions that have happened in our area. We are concerned about the threat of Lyme disease, although there's no report of Lyme disease being here at this point. a large number of us on the Irondequoit Deer Action Committee are concerned about the ecosystem, not only because it affects deer and plants, but it affects all the other animals that depend on that same ecosystem. We're concerned about the health of the deer, something people don't mention frequently, but if they overbrowse, they can eat themselves out of house and home and end up malnourished and dying of starvation. And we certainly are concerned about people and the fact that gardening is the #1 pastime in the United States, and people ought to be able to be allowed to do what they like to do without total disruption by one species of animal.
Working in cooperation with the state officials, a Cornell University Department of Natural Resources representative organized the DMU 96 Citizen Task Force in Irondequoit.
I was really delighted that DEC asked Paul Curtis to set up a citizens task force and involved people from really quite a wide range of organizations to try to look at the deer issue. I think it defused things a lot, taking it out of the hands of a grassroots citizens organization or the local governmental agencies. It set itself up with its own criteria, and everybody signed on to the process of consensus ahead of time, which I think was very helpful. I know there have been complaints leveled that it was weighted heavily in favor of deer killers, if you want to call them that. But if you really look at the constituency, it included Monroe County Cooperative Extension representative. It included a resident from a town that has no deer problem at all and who couldn't have cared less about the issue until he became informed. It included a naturalist from the local nature center, as well as a representative of the 2 local groups who've been active looking at the deer issue.
The Citizen Task Force process had several positive aspects from that. One of them being that the task force members themselves were satisfied with being able to voice their opinions to the agency and government officials. Another positive aspect was that the agency itself was perceived as being more professional. Wildlife managers were perceived as having the technical expertise needed to manage the deer population. Perhaps the most important aspect of the Citizen Task Force process is that a diversity of stakeholders were involved in making a deer management decision. They interacted with each other on the task force as well as with the agency, learning and educating each other about viewpoints of people in the community.
Not all of the reactions to the task force process were positive. The task force recommendation, a bait and shoot program, met with opposition from the community.
For somebody that lived here and heard those gunshots go off, it was a nightmare. Let me ask you, suppose I snuck into your backyard, didn't tell you when I was coming, didn't tell you when I was going to go, and begins shooting high-powered rifles from anywhere from 10 o'clock till 3 in the morning, sporadically, waking you up, and you had absolutely no control over it. You couldn't even go out there and see what I was doing. You couldn't even drive through streets that you normally travel because they were barricaded off. Would you put up with that? Do you think that's what you're paying your tax dollar for? No, I didn't think that the culling process was at all the way to handle a suburban deer population.
The deer culling that took place in the area last spring was positive for several reasons. It was held up in the courts until too late, which made it cost more money and all the rest of it. But we have clearly established now the legal right to proceed to cull the herd. That has been established and settled, and that issue is gone, and that's important in its own right. The deer that were taken provided a good scientific measurement of the health of the herd. Again, so much depends upon one's perspective. I read in the paper just recently that only 25% of the deer that were taken were going to starve to death before spring, so that why did we need to do it? And yet somebody else would say, 25% of them were close to death, and it's an indication of the poor health of the herd as a whole.
Issues such as expense, public safety, and concern for the animals have fueled the controversy in Irondequoit over bait and shoot.
My husband and I personally received numerous telephone calls morning, noon, and night with death threats and invoking God would bring punishment upon us as we have punished the deer. We had a pipe bomb, pseudo pipe bomb, left in our mailbox. I personally don't believe those have anything to do with any of the organized animal rights groups or animal activists in our area, but they allowed, without comment, incredible behavior to occur at public meetings where people were carrying banners that said kill the deer killers themselves, that talked about Gestapo tactics and Nazism.
I'm a little less optimistic than I was about getting total cooperation in supporting a single plan. And the reason is that I've seen very little evidence from the one side and the side that's anti-deer in any type of compromise. And furthermore, I've seen that the politicians, with the exception of one Irondequoit town councilman, have totally ignored the rapid technical advance that's being made in fertility inhibition, which I feel is the only way to handle a suburban wildlife population.
Well, I think the possibility of using other management tools, such as contraceptive devices of some type, immunocontraception is one of the more recent notions that's around. Those have promise, but only in certain circumstances, and we're some years away from being able to apply some of the techniques that we know work so well with human reproduction or with domestic animal reproduction for fertility control. We're some years away from being able to apply that to free-ranging animals. We don't have the delivery systems, we don't have the knowledge of the contraceptive effects that we need, and there's just considerable work to be done. And even when that does come into place, I'm not sure that that will be an option for all of wildlife management, because the problem is still there of the free-ranging animal, and treating the animal in such a way, immunizing it or managing its reproduction is going to be an extremely difficult proposition.
The idea of contraception sounds appealing, and it may be that it'll be a good technique in the future, but right now I don't think we can go out and use it and effectively control a population. For example, we still need to know how many deer we have there, because we need to know how many does need to be rendered infertile. And knowing how long they're infertile, that's essential information. So it doesn't relieve us of the responsibility for knowing about the deer population, the numbers. We need to have some idea of the sex ratio, the male to female ratio, and we need to still look at other mortality factors. So I think it's an idea that needs to be researched, but I'm not sure that we're ready to consider it a solution to the problem yet.
Based on a case study, which is the best information we have available at this time, most of the people prefer contraception as a long-term solution for deer management problems. Their opinions about different management techniques as for short-term solutions are mixed. Their perceptions about trap and transfer, bait and shoot, and bow hunting are the three methods that they really prefer as a short-term solution.
And there is such a thing as a shock syndrome that deer experience when they are moved from one place to another, especially when you take stressed deer, as these deer are, and move them to another location. You're introducing a lot of different variables there that invariably the population or the individuals that are moved end up dying very, very quickly. One study that I had read indicated that about 85% of those individuals moved were dead within a year.
Although some current options are impractical or untested, and others have met with opposition, most affected residents and wildlife professionals agree that some form of suburban deer management is needed.
If we didn't do anything to the deer population at all here in Irondequoit, just let it go, I think that would be the most inhumane procedure of any. Large herbivores of that nature are not necessarily self-controlling, and their populations will suffer as they increase. Their growth would be stunted, the vegetation would continue to be destroyed. More and more complaints, I'm sure, would be echoed by the drivers in the area, and as well as homeowners and the political scene.
Most people have not been able to adapt to the deer as well as the deer have adapted to people. So I definitely feel there is a need for suburban deer management.
The ultimate fate of the white-tailed deer in the town of Irondequoit and the Rochester metropolitan area has yet to be determined.
I think our legislators have to act like statesmen, and they know and agree, by and large, of what's the right thing to do, and I think they just have to do it. You're never going to get everybody to agree about anything, and it has to be done. It's a dangerous situation, and they've got to be statesmanlike.
If it continues to remain so divisive, and I feel so close-minded on many people's parts, that probably the best way to get a change of attitude is for some enlightened community to take advantage of the new technologies, control their deer herd, have a success, and perhaps our politicians will be embarrassed that we haven't done it and we've stayed with the older practices.
There may be controversy, but this isn't the only controversial issue that's facing our citizenry at this point. And if we can somehow defuse the opposition so it's not so heated and violent and vicious, then I think that the mass of general public really wants to do what's right, and they will go along with whatever conclusions are drawn.
Cornell Cooperative Extension recommends several steps for designing a deer management program as outlined in the publication, Resolving Public Issues and Concerns Through Policy Education. For more information on how to cope with deer populations in your area, write to this address.